So welcome, everybody. Amazing to see this Zoom room fill up for our second session in this wonderful learning community in this series. And a special welcome to our Kol Ami guest friends. Thank you so much for joining in. This is a three-part series, but you don't need to be at each of the parts for it to make sense. They each stand alone. We always start with some moments of visual access in our Zoom room for people who cannot see the screen. And so I will say today we have 30 different little Zoom squares in our, which encompasses 2 panels, so a big group. And usually we have a couple of them where there are 2 people on the screen, so it's really a few more than 30. And I am Rabbi Julie. I'm wearing my embroidered kippah, and it's cold here. I'm wearing my little hand warmers. I don't know about where you are. I think the heat has been turned off for the season. And sitting at my Zoom station in front of a map of the world. So really good to see everybody here. And we are going to open with our prayer for learning together. Same as candle lighting blessing, but ends la'asok v'divrei Torah. Please join me on mute. You can stay muted, but from your own rooms, join in. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you, source of inspiration, for inspiring us to delve deeply into Torah. And we consider all streams of learning big Torah. So we are engaging in Torah when we do this study together. I always like to start by asking, how many people got a chance to read both of the articles for today's class? Just hold your hand up and hold it up for a minute because we have a lot of people to see here. Okay, and how many people had a chance to read one or the other of them? Okay, wonderful. Okay, so we always wrap everybody in.
Where are the articles?
They're actually on the website. If you go to our website at www.lev-ha'ir.org. I'll spell it because we spell it funny, and maybe Bobby can put it into the chat box as well.
Oh, if you still have the emails that went out with the Zoom information for today, the links to the recordings are right in those emails. You can just click on them.
And the articles.
You can come back.
That's what I meant. Sorry. The links to the article.
It takes a team, Bobby.
It takes a team, and anybody who wants to use the chat box on most of your devices, at the bottom of your screen in the dock, there's a little icon that says chat. And if you click that, you'll be able to see people chatting in the chat box. Bobby has just put into the chat box a link for the recording from the first session. There will also be a recording from this session, and it will be emailed out to everyone who attended. And in addition to that, you can find on the website, which we will put in the chat box as well, the articles for these sessions, all 3 of the sessions in this 3-part series. Big picture, what we're looking at is the central slogan in Reconstructing Judaism, which was created by our founder, Dr. Mordechai Kaplan, decades ago. Judaism is an evolving religious civilization. We're looking at that big sentence and asking ourselves, well, if it's going to evolve, what is the process? How do we keep traditions and also innovate to meet the needs of the times? How exactly do we do that? And we're really delving deep, looking at the inner workings of this reconstructing Jewish process. Quick synopsis. In other strands of Judaism, there are other mechanisms for answering that same question. For instance, in ultra-Orthodox Judaism, your Rebbe decides for you what's permitted, what's not permitted, how to keep tradition and the need of the moment integrated. In orthodox strands of Judaism. It's a legal process, and it creates a halakha, a legally stated pathway into living a life that updates old things and helps people answer questions. And in conservative Judaism, all of the conservative rabbis actually vote on the changes in practice. In Reform Judaism, every individual makes their own decision of conscience. And in Reconstructing Judaism, we have our own internal mechanism for keeping tradition and innovation connected. And our mechanism is that it takes place in democratic community. Communities wrestle with the issues, and we create the pathway into the future. So we inherit the tradition, we create the future, and we reflect together on how to keep those two connected. I see a question coming into the chat box here, and it looks like it's coming from Catherine. Last time, I think you said that for Reconstruction to consider a person a Jew, they should have either parent Jewish and a Jewish education. So since I didn't have a Jewish education, I'm not considered a Jew, even though my family has been Jewish on both sides for generations. Can you please clarify? Let me just say, this is not going to be the focus of this class, but I'll just quickly respond to that. Catherine, if either of your parents was Jewish, that is a Jewish parent. Sounds like they were. But also you are getting a Jewish education right here, right now. It's very broadly defined. If you step into Jewish learning, you're part of that Jewish education process and you're qualified. So it's a very welcoming principle about what makes somebody Jewish. I hope that helps with that. So we're asking the big question about how can we keep our traditions alive, but also respond to the needs of the moment. And I'm going to give one example, and then we're going to really talk about the articles that give a different example. So one example, this is so interesting to me, is that Mordechai Kaplan offered the idea of peoplehood. How many here of people have heard of peoplehood in talking about Reconstructing Judaism here? If that's a term, I see a number of our kind of stalwart Reconstructing Jewish long-timers raising hands, but not a lot of people. That's really interesting. So Mordechai Kaplan was looking at, well, what unites Judaism, basically? What does it mean to have Judaism move into the future? And he said, well, what unites Judaism is the Jewish people. The Jewish people, figure out how to be Jewish. And he wasn't looking at legal rulings. He wasn't interested in that. He wasn't looking at like Talmud and halakha. He was looking at what he called folk ways. What are the people actually doing? What were the folk doing? And that would define kind of what was Jewish. Like if you were asking the question, what makes something Jewish? He said, go look at the people, see what the people are doing. Let's just talk about that for a minute, because I will tell you what I'm going to talk about is how that idea of peoplehood has been reconstructed since it was first offered up. But let's take a minute here of people how does that speak to you? Figuring out what's Jewish, go look at what Jewish people do. What do you think about that as a principle there? Because people would say things like, oh, well, okay, in the Reform movement, they started having worship services on Sunday using organs, like kind of Protestant style things. Many congregations don't do a lot of Hebrew. Now we bring new poetry in, we bring all sorts of new mind-body practices. Are we sure it's Jewish? What if it's Buddhist? What if it's something else? And Mordechai Kaplan would say, well, just are the Jewish people doing it? Then it's Jewish. What do you think about that?
Well, I think if a Jewish person does it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's Jewish. But if a community makes a decision that this is part of our practice, I think it kind of rises to a different level.
Beth, you are such a Reconstructionist, is all I can say.
Well,
did you hear how in Beth's answer, she took it not away from the land of individual conscience, which is a very American and reform way of thinking about anything individualistically. And she talked about a collective situation. Roberta, let's hear from you. Wait, you're on mute. You have to unmute yourself.
I guess I cheated a little bit. I did a paper on this many years ago. And I read the 3 big books.
Wonderful.
The 3 fat books, and that was the basis. And we're a civilization, which makes us a people. We've grown for many years from actually really from the Exodus on, not so much from Abraham. And although it does date back to Abraham and the writings that we study and learn, but actually our civilization began with our Exodus, and we built a civilization from there. And whatever we've done, we've evolved in every country we've gone to. We've changed, we've fit in, and we came back together to form Eretz Yisrael. So here we are, and that's.
Thank you, Roberta. And I see Catherine has a hand up.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, you can hear me, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you're good.
I think it depends on what that so-called tradition is. If you've got a community that's doing something hateful, then you obviously don't want to perpetuate it. So I think you have to make some moral judgments as to whatever tradition, so-called.
So Catherine, that's a really important, interesting idea. And let me push you on it. Who would make the judgments? Because that's what we're talking about, is who gets to decide, right? Mordechai Kaplan was saying, look at the people are going to decide. In your system, you're saying, no, we actually need to have some moral standards. Well, who has to have moral standards in deciding what's Jewish there?
Well, if community A has some relatively hateful, I'm not going to get into specifics, something that they've now adopted as theirs, then before it gets adopted by communities B, C, D, and E, they get to make the decision as to whether they're going to adopt it or not. I guess
you would look at a decentralized decision-making process of many communities just reflecting and making choices.
Well, isn't that kind of what you were saying?
Well, I'm saying Mordechai Kaplan proposed this idea, and so thank you for that. That's really interesting. And let's see if there's one or two. Roby, and then if there's one more comment, Iris Newman. Roby, you have to unmute.
Okay, here I am. Since I was completely raised as a Christian, I knew things had happened in the background, but I didn't know what. I struggled for years and years and years. And at some point, I figured that I have to find out what it is to be Jewish. So I joined the Reconstructionist movement early on and became bat mitzvah and everything else. So then I thought, no, I'm really Jewish. So I would go back to Holland, and the mother who would raise me would say, well, why do you have to become Jewish? And she really didn't like it. So it was a real struggle, but obviously my background and my parents who died in the Holocaust made me Jewish to start with. But it's a process that is difficult to pick up on when you're not raised that way.
Yeah, that's right, Roby, a real kind of identity quest. Okay, Iris was next.
What about people who are born to Jewish parents but don't practice Judaism? My brother being an example.
Yeah.
And he is certainly Jewish.
Yeah.
But
so Iris is raising a real challenge for Mordechai Kaplan's idea of peoplehood, because what if you're genetically Jewish, as Iris's brother clearly is, but you don't practice Judaism at all? Does that mean not practicing Judaism is Jewish? according to the peoplehood idea, you'd have to kind of follow that logic. So what Iris just raised is a challenge to the idea of peoplehood. Really very interesting. I see there still are many more people who would like to speak to this, so let's just carry this on a little bit more. I see Ruth and then Joanne. You have to unmute each of you when it's your turn.
You know, I guess it's the old story of ethnic. Are we an ethnic group or are we a religious group? And I think that kind of plays into it. Are we a race with quotes around it, or are we a religious group only? And so I was thinking just now of Iris's, it's Iris, right, brother? I mean, he's not a practicing Jew, but maybe he relates to Israel and Zionism. So is he Jewish or is he, you know, so forth? That's all I was going to say.
Ethnicity or religion. Thank you.
Right.
And Joanne.
On the menu bar, audio now unmuted.
Another challenge is, what if you look at the Jews, and especially people with children, and you see that Shabbos has disappeared, and particularly when there's boys in the family, if there's sports games on Saturday, the parents are going to take them. And if it's inconvenient on a Saturday to have Shabbos, then you don't have it because you got other things that seem to be more important. Then you're directly having a problem with what Shabbos is.
Okay, there you go. So, and let's make Etta and then Bonnie the last two people for this round. Etta?
I don't have a feeling of God, okay? But I have a strong feeling of being Jewish historically. The tradition preserves our history. That's how I feel. And it used to be, after the war, people would say, I'm not really Jewish, who was half Jewish, and someone would say, you're Jewish because it would come and get you. So it was identity as a Jew, how people feel towards you. But I try and think that the 10 Commandments and the one thou shalt not do unto others is the basis of my feeling. And when I observe tradition, I'm observing my history. And that's...
Yeah, thank you. And Bonnie.
Well, until I joined Lev Hair, I've never belonged to a synagogue. I'm 72 years old and I am 100% Jewish. And I don't follow the kosher laws. And I don't know a lot of my history. But in my heart and in my soul, I am totally Jewish. And I know a lot of other people who feel that way, that they're culturally Jewish, that they just feel it in their soul and don't necessarily practice anything specific.
Thank you. And so we have just complexified the issue of peoplehood right here in this Zoom room. Now, for the first 40 years, like 4 decades after Reconstructing Judaism was a movement, like from the 1960s to 2000-ish, I will tell you, peoplehood was a central pillar of understanding what Reconstructing Judaism meant. It was like the question was, well, what is Judaism? Look at what the people do. That's what peoplehood is about. But in the last 20 years, that concept has been completely reconstructed. And this is an example of how our own mechanism of being able to reconstruct what we think and do works. And why that got reconstructed was because of all these issues that complexified it. First of all, the idea of peoplehood is a very genetic idea. It's like peoplehood, it's sort of the bloodline in a way. It's like, well, who are the people? It's very ethnic and racial. And people started realizing in Judaism, actually, we have way more diversity than that. People come into families by adoption. People do interracial marriage and have interfaith families and all sorts of, different mixings and matchings. And if you're just going to have a genetic bloodline peoplehood, definition of what Judaism is, you're going to miss a lot of what's important. So that was one reason that it began to fall by the wayside. Another reason was if you're using peoplehood as an example, as the internal definition of what defines Judaism, if you're looking for the folkways, there's a lot of diversity within the Jewish people. If you think about it, there's Ashkenazic Judaism, Sephardic Judaism. That's the stream that came from Eastern Europe, the stream that came out of Spain after the Inquisition. There's, excuse me for a minute, I had to grab my puppy here. There's the way Judaism is practiced in Iraq. There's the way Judaism is practiced in New York City. You know what I mean? There's a lot of diversity. So like which people where get to define what Judaism is. Like as we really began to embrace the global diversity of Judaism in a bigger way, again, peoplehood made less sense as the principle by which you would decide what is Jewish, because the people were all over the place, very, very diverse. And that these are all interconnected ideas, the idea of not being so genetically based, the idea of really respecting global diversity. And then finally, the question of, well, who is the we that gets to decide? Who's in, who's out? For many years, women were out. Gay and lesbian people have been out. So who's the we that decides exactly? In certain denominations, it's like elite rabbis who decide, but that's not what Reconstructing Judaism ever was interested in. This is a much more democratic movement. And then who is the we? And it raised those questions of just looking at the we isn't always the right, most inclusive we. So is that who's going to define what Judaism? So for all those reasons, in the last 20 years, it's so interesting. The concept of peoplehood has slowly disappeared from our understanding of Reconstructing Judaism. I was really interested because when I was preparing for this class, I was reading the website and reading different documents. And I was actually really shocked to see that concept is never mentioned anywhere now. If you guys did look at the website a little bit, which was, I think, last time's assignment, the Reconstructing Judaism website, you will see that it's not an idea that's in there at all about what it means to evolve a civilization. It's just completely disappeared. Now, how did it disappear? Was through conversations, reflections, articles, books in our community. So a place where conversations happen in this community is at the Reconstructing Judaism conventions. How many people here have ever been to a convention? They're scheduled for every couple years. The next one's going to be in March of 2022. And I hope to go with a lot of our community members. So plan ahead. It's going to be in Tyson Corner, Maryland, right outside Washington, D.C. And Bobby has already presented a workshop. I actually submitted something also for consideration for that convention. And it's a wonderful place to come together with people from all the other Reconstructing Judaism communities and have these kinds of conversations. So that was one place where these ideas began to shift and change, and peoplehood was really challenged. Another place where peoplehood got challenged was in the Reconstructing Judaism journals. Right now, the biggest one I think is called Explore. It's changed its name over the years. It used to be called The Reconstructionist, which is the journal of the movement. And there's articles in these places. No, Evolve, not Explore, Evolve, right? Bobby is nodding her head. Roberta's nodding her head. Right, it's called Evolve now. And, really brilliant articles get presented with the thinkers of our movement kind of looking at these kind of things like peoplehood. And then the third place that this was challenged and changed was welling up from the network of congregations the rabbis and the lay leaders saying, well, actually, peoplehood doesn't really exactly work for us. Like, that doesn't really make sense. We have people who do and don't practice anything Jewish, but they're culturally Jewish or their identity's Jewish. But how can you really decide what Judaism is based on what they are practicing? Because there's a huge wealth of diversity. And also some of it wouldn't even look like what you're thinking of as Jewish. It's more how your heart feels, or that you feel connected to your family tree or something like that. And so so anyway, and there was one other very important book that came out by Shaul Magid, who is I guess, what would you exactly call him? He's probably a sociologist by trade, but he studies the Jewish community, and he's very enamored of Reconstructing Judaism and centralizes it out of all the denominations. Very interesting. And he wrote a book called Post-American Judaism. I think that's the name of the book. I don't recommend reading that book. It's a very hard book to read. But the big idea that he said was the Reconstructing Jews have moved away from identity, sort of ethnically rooted identity, and have found other ways to allow people to be many things. Like we can be Jewish, we can be American, we can be parents, we can be part of a gay community, we can be part of a people with disabilities community, we can be part of a cooking community, a gardening community, a Democrat, Republican community. I mean, we can have many, many different identities, and to stop reifying an identity, to see it as much more fluid, complex, and literally evolving. And he said, of all the denominations, Reconstructing Judaism is the one that knows how to do that the best, that can most respect the diversity of who we are as participants in this community, and has the most kind of logical internal mechanism for evolving Judaism, which is this, just to be really in process all the time. It isn't about a product, like what's the law. It isn't about that. That's not what it's about. It's about a process of being in relationship together in a community. And that's the reconstructing process. Let's be in relationship in community, and we'll work all this out. And that's what we're doing. So for all those reasons, the concept of peoplehood fell out of the entire lexicon. You never hear about peoplehood anymore, which I just think is so interesting. Because like when I went to rabbinical school many decades ago, it was just absolutely a central pillar that we studied. And it has evolved and been reconstructed since then. So it's kind of an exciting example of what it means to reconstruct our own Reconstructing Judaism heritage. We are going to look at another example in just a minute. I just want to see if anybody has any questions or brief comments on that round. Ruth. You have to unmute, Ruth.
I would like to know why it's such a small group, that it never seemed, when I look around, every shul or every synagogue that's Reconstruction seems very small, the groups, like it never really evolved into a large popular movement, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ruth. That's a really good question. And to tell you the truth, Mordechai Kaplan never wanted Reconstructing Judaism to be a denomination. He wanted it to be a movement, like the civil rights movement that can influence everybody else. And in fact, Reconstructing Judaism has had an enormous influence on the entire field of Jewish community, like the bat mitzvah, for instance. You know, like everybody does bat mitzvahs, almost everybody. Now, that was a Reconstructing Judaism contribution. The community center, you know, having a Jewish daycare. Not even necessarily a religious Jewish daycare, but just like Jewish setting. Those kind of things were contributed to the whole Jewish world. And so that the influence and impact of Reconstructing Judaism is so much bigger than the numbers that actually pay dues to any particular thing. And those are good questions and worthy of more reflection as well. John.
Yes, and other factors come up, like the I'm sorry to say this, the ultra Orthodox, like the Haredi in Israel, who think they're the only Jews in the world, and some of the Hasidic sects, and also the kind of, there's this secular tendencies of Judaism, actual secular congregations of Jews, like having services, but not mentioning God. And also, the so-called Messianic congregations. I mean, I do not recognize them as Jewish at all, but they think they're Jewish, and that's another complicating factor.
Yeah, you're right about that. Okay, I think is that for you, Paul? Paul.
Add that I just saw, I think, a news program that said less than 50% of Americans actually affiliate with a church or synagogue. So almost everyone that I know now, we are sort of in the minority that we are connecting to a synagogue. And so I think it's happening even more globally than just with the Jews, because I think what John brought up, if you're fundamentalist in each religion, they're going to really adhere to a certain, long-term orientation to that church or that synagogue. And so I think this is just kind of the way of the world, is that you almost have to create this reconstructing in almost every religion to try to attract and gain congregants, because I think that we're such a different world. When you started this discussion, I sort of short circuit because we're so interfaith and so many other things than when I was a kid, and so I do think, it's great that this sect of Judaism is willing to keep shifting and evolving, rather than maybe the Orthodox, who are rigid and saying, nope, this is it. This is a Jew. We're not letting anybody else, and even in Israel. So I'm really pleased to hear that there's fluidity like this, because otherwise, if you don't grow and change, you wither and die sometimes. So
yeah,
you see so many people are not affiliated at this point, with an organized religion.
That's really right. I mean, up until, in traditional times before modernity, if you didn't comply with the Jewish community's ruling on you, you could be basically excommunicated, banished from the community, and you had nowhere to go. So it was a very powerful tool, because the dominant societies hated you and you couldn't survive as an individual outside of a community. But with modernity, they say now, we all became Jews of choice. Every single one of us, whether you converted or not, you're a Jew by choice, because you don't have to do anything Jewish. And, you're welcome to do everything Jewish. And so, what does it even look like? So that's really, we're in a different era now, and Reconstructing Judaism has been a response to modernity. You never would have had something like this that's all about process and relationship in the 200s or the 500s or the 600s or the thousands. This is a modern stream of Judaism. When we talk about evolving a religious civilization, this is a response to the needs of these times, which is that we're all Jews by choice. So what are we going to do to keep people engaged and developing it? And our answer is, it's about the process of doing that together. It's not about some product decision, like you're a this or you're a that, or you're, going to start Shabbat at exactly 6:15 when the sun sets. It's not about the product in those ways. It's about the process of being in relationship, being a community, and facing these questions about what it means to be human through Jewish lenses. So so we're going to actually segue from there into the very interesting topic of God. And I want to start by asking, how many people here have ever sat through High Holy Day services with the machzor in front of you with all the prayers in it and felt like, what is this language about? God, he's sitting on a throne and judging us? What? How many people have ever had some questions about the language of the High Holy Day prayers? I see a lot of hands going up. Yes, many hands. And I've certainly had many people come to me and say, Rabbi, I feel very Jewish, but this language doesn't relate to me. I just can't relate to the language of God and his hosts on high. What does it even mean? And so I'd like to turn to some of the people who did read the God as Metaphor article to just offer some of the ideas up into this room so that we can have everybody wrapped into the same conversation. Not so much your reflections on it right now, but what was Toba Spitzer, Rabbi Toba Spitzer, brilliant, brilliant colleague of mine, saying about God as metaphor, and what that means for how we evolve a civilization. In the old days, the way God was spoken about was God's the Lord, the King, the Master. And that made sense to people as the metaphor for those days because they lived a life where that was kind of the relevant relationships. We're in a very different world. We're in a much more democratic, egalitarian world. And there's a real kind of jarring mismatch between that language and our experience. And so what does she say there? Bobby.
So I think she lays out a way to think about God that's much easier to accept and is in line with something that's really turned my head around about thinking of God as a spirit or God within us, as opposed to the more traditional way of thinking about God. And I just found, I really had a smile on my face as I read her article because she really made it easier to accept God and embrace, not accept as much as embrace God in a different way.
Thank you. Who else wants to offer something from Toba Spitzer? Roby.
I really loved her article because it really spoke to me. You know, you can think of images. You have to somehow define something in where you are with your spirit and so forth. And she really gave a lot of good examples of how you can connect. Even though the original language of God is a king and this and that, especially the caring kind of God, the mother type God, have always spoken to me. But, you don't need to think of it in concrete terms, but in poetic terms, in images, including water and place and makam and all those things. I really loved her way of talking about this. It wasn't intellectualized. It was really close to how you feel about things.
Thank you, Roby. Yeah, so basically she's saying that back in the old days, when people used king, master, Lord, that was a metaphor that worked for them back then because their experience matched with that particular metaphor. But we also get to choose metaphors that work for us. Like we're not locked into using language of Lord, God, King in our own current contemporary times. That's why we add poems and modern teachings in, because we get to choose. We do want to stay connected to that language of the past because it connects us to our ancestors. But we have to see it as that they were choosing metaphors that worked for them. We can still respect that working for them, but we also need to choose some metaphors that work for us in relation to God. And that's how we are reconstructing that language that we get from them and finding our own metaphors for today. So what I want to do right now is either in the chat box or out loud, if you don't have access to the chat box, I want people to pile out metaphors that would speak to you. Not Lord, Master, King, but when you think of a higher power or something bigger than you that connects you to the sacred, to the spiritual. What word, what metaphor speaks to you? And let's see if we can pile those up. I'm seeing spirit come in here. I'll read them out loud from the chat box. And people are welcome to unmute and speak it out. Spirit, universe. Creator. Best friend. Loving presence, guider.
Hold the audio now unmuted.
Breath of life.
Hashem.
Hashem, the name. Caring, benevolence, nature. Nature and all creatures. A force beyond description. Wow. A benevolent verb, right? There's a whole saying that God is a verb, to God. A benevolent verb, yes. Perfection of intention, life force. Wholeness. Infinite being, mystery of existence. Oh, wow. I think sometimes, John is saying God is simply John. I think of development, like kind of what drives development is a God practice. Who else? Inspiration. Guide. All right, everybody think of one more. Challenge your own self to think of another metaphor for these concepts. Protection. Life breath. How caring benevolence manifests itself? That's beautiful, Etta. Makom, place to be. And Ruth is saying she's missing a personal God, and we're going to talk about that. Kindness, source of light, creative force for hope, love, and life. Yeah, creative force, that's beautiful. Hope, love, and life. Okay. Bonnie, are you raising your hand? You're on mute, Bonnie. Loving energy, lovingness.
No, I was trying to chat empathy.
Empathy, okay, yes. Beautiful. Okay, this is super. So that takes us into Dr. Jacob Staub's article. And this might be a little bit complicated, but he's talking in that article about something that Maimonides invented called predicate theology. Predicate theology means we can't see or touch God. We can't see God in the world, but we can see the manifestation of God. So when we see kindness or beauty or love or growth, creativity, we're seeing Godness in the world. And so predicate theology means we can say God is kind. Kind is the predicate in that sentence. So kind is God. That's how that works. Did everybody get how that works? We say, God is loving, so love is God. God, creates beauty or is the source of beauty, so beauty is God. That's predicate theology. And that came from, Maimonides 1,000 years ago or something. So that's old. But Jacob Staub is saying there's a problem with that, and we need to reconstruct this idea of God now. I mean, that was an amazing idea. It was a breakthrough back then because, if you think about it, Maimonides was responding. He was reconstructing the idea that God is a man in the sky. You know, Maimonides in, you know, medieval Arab times there was a lot of new development of reason, and he didn't believe God was a man in the sky. It didn't make any sense. So he reconstructed and said, no, God's not this man in the sky. God is the predicate here, which is kindness, love, you know, peace. So Maimonides gave us a gift of how to understand God that lasted about 1,000 years. But Jacob Staub is saying that system doesn't work anymore, because some people have put their finger on this, such as Catherine and whoever said, I miss a personal God, because predicate theology leaves us with all the good stuff being God. But what about when I'm feeling lonely, despairing, hopeless, angry, sad? You know, what if when I'm not feeling kind, connected, loving, beautiful, right? And so what Jacob says is God, you know, we need to reconstruct God now to see God as kind of an accompanying presence. Not only the God of the good stuff, but the God that's just present with whatever a human being is going through. The God that's with us. And this is a complete reconstruction of Mordecai Kaplan's idea. Mordecai Kaplan literally said, God is the process that makes for salvation. These other ideas like God is spirit, God is development, God is creativity. That was Mordecai Kaplan, the inventor of Reconstructing Judaism. And people used to joke, okay, Reconstructionists are going to write their prayers to whom it may concern, because it was such an impersonal kind of force in the universe, not a personal God, not a God of comfort. And for years, Reconstructionists, you know, didn't use any personal God language. God was a process. God was a spirit, you know. And so now in this day and age, where there's deeper understanding of just the pain of being human, I think, sort of psychological understanding and historical understanding, and just we're in a different place, that's not enough anymore. In Mordecai Kaplan's era, it was a very, if you think about it, he was writing it was pre-Holocaust. He was writing in an age of tremendous progress, where like mechanical this and that was going to solve everything, technology. The nuclear weapon that could destroy all humanity hadn't been invented. 6 million Jews hadn't been killed, although it was post-World War I that was pretty shocking to people. But it was basically an era of some optimism and some hope in progress. And post that era, post-World War II, there's been much more a sense of, you know, it's not all going to be easy to fix. Everything's not always going to develop and be creative and transcend and go well and be a process of salvation. And we need some other vision of what God is, which maybe is just to accompany us through the mess while we do the best we can. And so in contemporary Reconstructing Judaism, we have reconstructed that God idea. So that I don't think most Reconstructionists today, rabbinical students, rabbis, or any community members, think of God just as, you know, a sort of only as a force in the world. There's something much more nourishing and nurturing about the God concept today. That's our metaphor that works for us today. So, and if we aren't there yet, let's keep reconstructing God in that way so that God can be something that actually supports us in living our lives and is not something so transcendent and far away and other that it offers no value in living a life. So I think that's a lot. I'm going to open it wide up now for discussion from all these interesting minds here in this Zoom room. So if you would like to speak to any piece of any of that, raise your hand or use the icon and we'll gather up some ideas. Carol and then Ruth.
I have had one extremely powerful experience with God, and it was in a Christian setting at Esperanza, where I went for dentistry for a number of years, following a dentist who'd been my dentist for, let's say, 25 years. My granddaughter was going to Israel in the summer, and it was a tense time. And the dentist hygienist said to me, "May we pray with you for your granddaughter?"
Wow.
And I said, yes. And I think if I were to describe what they are, they're a branch of evangelical Christians, deeply religious, lovely people. And they prayed for the welfare of my granddaughter, for the safety of her class, for the safety of the teachers, for the safety and welfare of the state of Israel. And the word Jesus Christ never came out of their mouths. And I felt so cared for. It was a relief of my anxiety. And I did want to share that.
Carol, thank you so much. That is a beautiful story. And what I'm hearing in it is that they gave you a God of care.
Yes.
A God of connection, a God of alliance or joining, accompanying. They gave you that God. Not a God sitting in a throne judging you. And not some kind of force in the universe, but they gave you a God of relational care. They're beautiful. I think we had said Ruth next, and then Bobby with an E.
Yes, you answered it a little bit, but when you say a more personal God, could you give us some more metaphors besides relational care? I mean, I heard a lot of other metaphors from the past, but okay, if it's a more personal God, what metaphors would maybe be used for that?
Yeah, good question. So I think of it as, our hands, our hearts, our heads as the limbs of God in a way. So it's when you take soup to somebody in need or visit somebody who's sick or even kind of connect with somebody around, their need or your need, that's God in action. That you're experiencing God in those moments. That would be another way of saying God of care. It could be interpersonal care. It could be political care. But, another way of saying God is here with us in action. That's God happening. Bobby, I think we were with Bobby with an E, and then we'll be to Phil.
Hi, I grew up in a conservative congregation, bat mitzvah. I've always identified as Jewish from birth till present. But around 50 years ago, I had a very frightening experience that just scared me to the core. And I desperately felt I needed protection to feel safe. And I actually took the Solomon Head of Christ painting, and I went to a retreat place for several days, and I envisioned Jesus having his white cloak around me to protect me, and I got through that period. And ever since then, I felt sort of conflicted about it because I felt the need to go to more personal representations of God, whether it's I definitely do not consider myself a Christian and resent even the thought that someone would say, oh, well, then why don't you become Messianic Christian or Jew or whatever that is. But yet there was that point where I needed something to hold my hand in the vast universe that kept me safe, that I didn't feel I could find in my Jewish understanding at the time. And I still have a question about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean there. Like it's a beautiful thing that Christians can turn it over to Jesus.
Exactly.
And that's just a metaphor that Christians use about Jesus. And we actually have those metaphors available to us as well in Judaism, but we haven't really, that's not been what we've mined as the metaphors in our tradition. And we have the capacity now in this modern time to understand it in a bigger way and choose some of those metaphors that work there. Thank you, Bobby, for sharing that. Who did I say was next? Was it Etta? Oh, Phil and then Etta.
Thank you. I think this is probably more of a Buddhist concept maybe, but I do feel my connection is both very personal and totally impersonal at the same time. It's a feeling of being part of something larger, like a drop of water in the sea, that I still exist, but I have an identity that's larger than what I normally think of when I'm not feeling that spiritual connection. It's humbling and comforting to feel like it's not all about me. The opposite of that is the ego, which makes you want to think it's all about yourself. And I try to, part of my connection to the mystical or spiritual life is to let go of that and feel the larger me, which is the us, which is the world. I don't know if that makes any sense. It's hard to explain.
Thank you very much for that. Yes. Etta.
So, I think I always always went to Hebrew school, always belonged to a synagogue. So always felt that God was always a vengeful God. It didn't really, and so I never took to it very well. But I always think of the book of Job. God sitting on a throne and absolutely playing around. And I would love to study the book of Job. I don't know where it fits.
So Etta, let's take that. You've brought bringing a problem into this conversation. So let's take your problem. There's the book of Job, right? And let's choose a different metaphor for God in that story, because the metaphor used there is sort of God on the throne playing with the people. But what if we choose a different metaphor, such as reality or fate? Just it is the way it is. And the message being, through Job's experience, any human being is going to face something harder than they ever knew they'd have to face.
It's good.
Right? That's just kind of what's true, really, in the journey of the human life. I don't think there's anybody who hasn't faced something harder than they ever could have imagined having to face.
I am so grateful, because in those few words, it made me understand the book of Job, okay?
Well, thank you, Etta. And I have to say, I think all of us here in this Zoom room are in a certain set of decades of life. Some of us more elder than others, but all of us in a certain set of decades. I do a lot of counseling, and I have my own kids who are in their 20s, basically. And I do a lot of counseling as well of young people. And I think there's something about being at this stage of the life journey where you're going to have to live through whatever's harder than you ever thought you'd have to face. Like you've been through some of it. You've come out the other end of some of it. You kind of have that wisdom, and you have a vaster spiritual plane perspective, maybe, than I see some of the young people who are just having just huge rates of anxiety and depression. And our counselors in this room can probably attest to what they're seeing as well. They just haven't lived long enough to get that the human journey is hard. It's hard to be human. And so some of those stories, like about Job, use a certain metaphor, which is God on the throne, to tell the story. We have a lot of other metaphors as well that we can use and choose. But the essence of it is, you're going to go through hard times as a human being. It's not just all going to be a linear obvious straight path. You're going to go through hard stuff. Little pause on that. Okay. I hope I'm not leaving anyone out here. Susan Thompson, I see your hand is up.
Thanks. I just wanted to say, I was raised by a conservative German Jewish family. And I think some of the metaphors you said about God the Almighty, etc., they were present, but there was just a sense of acceptance. There wasn't a sense of what I have now is participatory and relational. And I think that before it was just go and read the prayer book, and most of it I didn't understand because it was all in Hebrew. And God is right. God will tell you what to do. Just follow this, follow this, follow this. But now I feel like it's much more relational. I feel more involved. I feel like it's a sharing control over my life. If I invite the Spirit, sometimes people will call it God, to join me or guide me, that's why I put guide in, I feel like I have a direction, but that I have some control over that direction, quite a bit of control over the direction. And then communally, I feel that our congregation has control over the direction. And for me, that's much more meaningful than just going on a Shabbat morning or on the holidays and reciting something and not feeling that it meshes with my personal values. And I think I see that in some of the younger people too. I think that sometimes they drop out of the old ways that we had, where even to the point of being forced to go to those Shabbat mornings, to synagogue, to have this, to have that, you know, and they feel like they have no control in it. They're really not involved. And sometimes you'll even see it. I've seen it at Seders where kids are bored, you know, or at high holidays. But I think when I look at some of the Jewish renewal, the Reconstructionists, I see the people that are involved. And I see joy. I see commitment. Not that we didn't have commitment before, but in a different way. And I'm really happy about it. And my experience in power too, is that communally, no matter what God you believe in, whether it's Muslim, Christian, whatever, you're involved in something that gives you a sense of meaning.
I want to just lift up a few words I heard from Susan: involvement, engagement, participation. That this is a mutual process of kind of God and humanity. Thank you, Susan. And let's go to Karen and then Kathy.
Thanks, Rabbi. I don't think you saw my hand before.
I didn't see it, but I got your message.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to add that one of the things that I love about Reconstructing Judaism and why I've been a member for so long is that in my young adult life, I couldn't find a place where I felt okay, where I felt like I wasn't weird, you know. And the thing that I love is that it seems like there's such a wide range of what you are allowed to believe here, that you can be secular, you can be whatever. But the only times, like sometimes like when we have these discussions, and I do believe in a mystical God, I do believe in miracles, I do believe in another dimension. Then when we have these certain discussions, I start to feel out of it again. Like I'm not, like maybe I don't belong here, which I don't think is true, but I just don't want us to lose sight of the fact that some of us, maybe not believe in, you know, the Father on the throne, but that we believe in a mystical, you know, believe in a mystical God. And I don't want to feel weird because I believe that.
Karen, I think that's so important, because Mordecai Kaplan was fighting against superstition and a kind of supernaturalist God of, you know, it was God who parted the Red Sea kind of thing. But how that's being reconstructed in modern times, I think there's much more of a sense of mystery and, you know, kind of just the holy, those ideas now in the world of reconstructing Judaism. So that concept of no supernaturalism that Mordecai Kaplan offered into the world at the time he lived is being reconstructed. And there's much more of a sense of the ineffable, the mystical, the unknowns,
I do sense that. I just don't want us to lose, like, I want us to be large enough.
Yes.
To accommodate, you know, people with a range of beliefs, which I always felt Reconstructionism offered. And that's the only place I ever felt, you know, spiritually comfortable.
Well, coming back around to those so-called supernatural concepts, 100 years after Mordecai Kaplan, we're in a different world.
Right.
We're in a very different world. So, Kathy, you will be our last speaker for now. Is your hand intentionally up there, or is that a leftover hand?
No, it's intentional.
Oh, good. Okay, so you'll be our last speaker for now.
Okay. I appreciate the mention of Job and the acknowledgement of the hardships of life, and the person that spoke about participation and you know, reality, you know, being real in modern times, in the times we live in. And I also brought to mind, Marilyn Price said the other night on Shabbat that this is not usually said in Judaism so much, but other people say it from other religions. I am blessed. When you ask somebody, how are you? I am blessed. Now, that's not a common response from Jews. I don't say it, but she made the point that, and you know, it brings to mind Black people who are so challenged right now. They barely are recognized as human beings in a lot of places. And to hear the genuine response, how are you? I am blessed. And to hear someone say it, and it's really coming from the core. I appreciate that. And I think that it's not a bad option to say that as a response. How are you? I am blessed. I am blessed, but from that really core place. And so even if life presents the greatest challenges, we still recognize the blessings that we have. And that's something just to throw out into reconstructing our Judaism.
I love that, Kathy. And it also raises for me the issue that one of the things reconstructing Judaism, reconstructed from traditional Judaism, was the idea that we can learn from other cultures and religions. Like we can turn to, you know, spiritual Black Christian Americans, for instance, like you're doing, and say, I admire that. That speaks to me. And in traditional Judaism, it was all about keeping Jews separate. Don't look to anybody else. Don't admire, appreciate, ward off, you know, protect yourself against any other religion, build barriers of separation. And so Reconstructing Judaism helped open that up to say we're part of a global, you know, human community, and there are many different religions, and we can learn from each other and appreciate each other. So I really like that. Anyway, we're going to start winding down here. And I do have one announcement for Power people who are in Philadelphia for just a moment, which is that this Thursday, April 29th, is our Power Statewide Political Symposium, Part 3. at 6:30. And I really encourage people to come in. You can register on the Power website calendar on April 29th to get the link. It's all in cyberspace. This is for people who are not here in Philadelphia with Power or part of Power. Actually, you don't have to be in Philadelphia right now because it's in cyberspace. But this is our social justice place of faith where we meet with people of all other faiths and actually do good for our state. So I do see a few questions in the chat box that are loose threads. We're not going to have time for all of them right now, but we do have one more session in this series. And I hope everybody will be part of that. And if you're able to do the reading from last time, this time, or next time, to be part of that. So what I want to end with now is two things. Our song for Torah study, of course, Kaddish D'Rabbanan song, and then to count the Omer together because we are together now, even though it's not the night. So here's our song. Please sing along with me. Stay muted. For our teachers and our students and the students of our students, we ask for peace and love and kindness, and let us say amen. We ask for peace and love and kindness, and let us say amen. We ask for peace and love and kindness, and let us say amen. Anybody who would like to stand for the counting of the Omer is welcome to, in body or in spirit. And it's the 28th day, or will be the 29th night of the Omer. The Omer, of course, being this period of ascent between slavery and Sinai, from the depths of slavery to the peak of receiving Torah at Sinai. So it's the same as the candle lighting blessing, but it ends al Sfirat HaOmer, about the counting of the Omer. So please join me, but stay on mute. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kitshanu B'mitzvotav V'tzivanu al Sfirat HaOmer. Thank you for the inspiration to count this spiritual ascent towards Sinai. Today is the 28th day of the Omer. Tonight will be the 29th day of the Omer because Jewish days start at night. And the spiritual quality of the day is considered to be kindness in humility. So I bless us all right now, right here, with kindness in humility. And let's just take a breath. Come to the end of this learning session together. And anybody who would like to put a word in the chat box or speak it into the Zoom room of one thing you're taking away from today, feel free to do that before we close the Zoom room. Let me just also check, is someone the host right now? Because I think Bobby had to leave.
I'm the host.
Okay, so you'll close the session when the time comes. Wonderful. Thank you, Patricia. Okay, I'm going to read from the chat box. I see hope, peace, great session. As a new person to Reconstructing Judaism, I appreciate it. Thank you for hearing all of us. Anybody else want to add something really helpful and thoughtful? Inclusion. Wonderful. I'm going to gather all of that up and say amen. And I will see everybody soon. Everybody take care. God concepts can be evolved. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you,
Bye.
everybody. Good night.
Good night. Good morning.
Good night. Oh, good morning, y'all. Good night.
Thank you.